Okay, hi guys, welcome back. This is the second in a series of videos on helium mining coverage and antennas and the like. In this video, I'm going to concentrate on the use of high gain antennas at high elevations, and I'm going to dismiss all the suggestions online that you should use only lower gain antennas at height and never use high gain antennas. And in fact, you should always use high gain antennas if you possibly can. Okay, so as I've said, the effective coverage area of these cone diagrams is as you see here. And this presentation is going to concentrate on why this is wrong, and in particular, high gain antennas at height. Okay, so effective coverage, what is it? Well, we're going to take a look at message success rate, we're going to look at path loss, and we're going to look at antenna radiation patterns. Okay, so what is message success rate then? Well, it's a case that coverage doesn't just start and then stop. It's not a case it works and then it doesn't work. It's a case of as the signal level reduces, the number of messages that you can decode reduces as well. And as a result of this, we end up with a percentage success rate, a percentage of the messages that are received properly. And this can be best illustrated with this chart here. Here we've got a chart of signal L of neg60 to about neg140 with the success rate from 0 to 100%. We can see that as the signal reduces, the percentage of successful messages reduces as well. And you get to this point where at a certain level the success rate drops away very rapidly. Now this isn't specific to LoRa, this is just my experience of IoT in general, but it highlights the point that as the signal drops, the success rate drops in line with it. But this leads to some obvious questions, and they are, well, what percentage do we define as having coverage? What percentage do we define as effective coverage? Well, the answer to that is simply that it's open to interpretation, yours, mine, or the Helium blockchain itself. Okay, so before we go any further, I just need to clarify some terms. Now we have the free space path loss, which is the signal loss between a transmitter and a receiving antenna with no obstacles in there at all. We have the link budget, which is a calculation of the maximum path loss. We have the receive sensitivity, which is the minimum signal we can get away with to decode messages. We have the link margin, which is the amount of our wanted signal is better than our minimum signal required. The signal to noise ratio, and the fading margin, which is an allowance for the way the signal changes due to propagation effects like multipath. And finally we have the spreading factor, which is the amount by which LoRa data is spread across its bandwidth. Now what does the message success rate depend on? Well, it depends on the link margin, the fading margin, the antenna pattern, and the spreading factor. So, some equations.
Boring!
Sorry, bear with me. Okay, so we have the link margin, which is the power that you've received minus the minimum signal you can have. We have the receive sensitivity, which is that equation there, and the noise figure in SNR, and that's the important one because that depends on the quality of the miner's receiver, and the signal to noise ratio, which depends on the spreading factor of the message. We have the receive power, which is the transmit gains minus transmit losses, minus receive gains and receive losses. Now the receive losses themselves is again the antenna and cable stuff, but importantly the path loss and the fading margin, and that's what we'll come on to now. Now let's stick some practical numbers into that. The receive sensitivity works out at about neg130 dBm, and the free space path loss, that's equal to this equation here, but essentially is 20 times the log of the distance in kilometres plus that constant of 91.2 dBm. Now as a summary, the maximum path loss we can get away with, if we make some assumptions, is for the EU about 150 dBs, and in the States where the IRP is higher, we can get away with a max path loss of about 165 dB. Now the fading margin, well that's the way the signal varies with time, frequency, speed and location. Now that impacts the link balance, more so at lower signal levels. And that's because if the signal is varying at lower signal levels, then some of it will be below the minimum threshold we can get away with, and so we may lose those messages, and as a result the message success rate will be a lot lower. If the signal is very high, then you don't really bother that much if the signal's varying, because it's not going to affect you. Now fading margin is more important in non-line of sight environments, such as a suburban or urban environment. It's generally taken as about 6 dB. Okay, so far we know that the message success rate is a good indicator of coverage. It depends on path loss and fading margin, and it's about a maximum path loss of 150 dB in the UU. So what about the antenna then? So the effective area of coverage of these cone diagrams again is as you see there, but again that's not like it is in reality. And if you refer back to one of my previous videos, you'll show that a kind of a collinear or dipole antenna looks as something a little bit more like this. We've got the main lobes there in red and some of the side lobes there in orange of a lower signal level. And in terms of message success rate, we could kind of consider that those main lobes are about 95% success rate. Now if we can imagine that the signal goes a little bit further out but the performance is a bit lower, then we could consider that the coverage looks something like this. An area in orange of a lower signal but a greater area of coverage but poorer performance, and maybe in that sort of an area we get about a 75% success rate, and again lower with the slightly lower side lobes again, that this time is in green. And then if we take that one stage further, then we can see that perhaps the signal area again is greater with a poorer performance again. And in this example in green, we're going to see that this signal area now covers that area, and maybe because the area is bigger and the performance is worse, maybe we'll only get 25% of messages being received properly, and then the really weak side lobes and stuff maybe only 10% success. But the point that I'm making is that the area in reality of an antenna is not this cone-shaped diagram, it's much greater than that, depending on what we call effective. Now again, other propagation effects of interest are reflections and refractions. Again, these cone diagrams might suggest that coverage just flies over the top of the city environment like this, but that's not how things work in reality. In reality, we get reflections of signal of other buildings, and we get refractions off buildings and corner of buildings like I'm showing you here. Now if we take this along with our antenna diagrams from before, then it's not a case of, as shown there, it's more a case of something like this. And that is, we have that strong area of decent coverage in red there, then we have the slightly poorer performance but still very good in orange area there that you see, and we're still getting reflections off these buildings deep down into the canyons in the city centre, and we're also getting reflections off the other buildings like you see there. And yes, they're a bit lower signal, and in this case they're reflecting off the wider area of coverage of the antenna. So again, the performance is going to be a lot worse, maybe not that much worse. And again, we get a reflection off that building there that we can see, and that reflects over to our house with its minor and still provides coverage. The point is, you do get a signal there. You will have coverage and performance, a minor or a low antenna height. So this idea of a very small area of effective coverage from a high gain antenna height is simply wrong. Now to highlight my point, let's have a look at the real life radiation pattern of an antenna, in this case the RAC 8 dBi fiberglass omni antenna. And there we can see the antenna radiation pattern of the antenna itself. But then if we add on the typical kind of cone diagram antenna, we get something like that. And then if we add on my kind of example of more of a real life collinear antenna, we get something like this. And so what that highlights is that all these main side lobes and back lobes of the real life antenna are actually quite large. They're maybe only 15, maybe 20 dBs lower. Much greater area of coverage in these cone diagrams. And that's important because of the impact it has in real life, such as, my previous slide. So if we have a look at a real life example, let's take, for the sake of argument, the message success rate we want is 75%, and we can see to get that, if we look at our little diagram from before, that works out of needing a signal of about -120 dBm, and that reduces our path loss, our maximum path loss, by about 20 dB, which means the maximum path loss that we can cope with is 130 dB, thereabouts. So if we put some numbers to our real life example, transmit and receive antennas 5 kilometers apart, then the receive sensitivity as before is -130 dBm, the free space path loss about 105 dB, which results in our receive power being -94 dBm. Now if we compare that from the previous slide where we know that the minimum signal we need for a high performance is -120 dBm, then do the math and you can see that we have about a 25 dB extra drop in signal level and still have a great performance. So let's use that in our real life example back to our city environment, and we can see there that 5 kilometers away from the antenna we get -94, but we still get reflections from those buildings as we did, and so if as long as we have a no more than 25 dB drop in signal to that miner in the house as before, then that means we do still get coverage. And you can see again, if we look at that little radiation diagram, you can see that areas of coverage in those kind of angles are still way less than 25 dB drop. So as a result, in reality, you will get coverage in those little houses. Now at the end of the day, high gain antennas do not fly over the top of low buildings. Signal and performance will drop, sure, but you'll still have proof of coverage witnesses to a beacon as long as the received signal level is above the maximum path loss and the received signal is better than you need for a particular message success rate. Okay, thanks for watching guys. I hope you found it useful and interesting. Please feel free to add some comments below and I'll get back to you. And please do the usual like, subscribe and notifications.